friends. Welcome to the Andy Social Podcast. My name is Andy Dowling, and if we haven't been introduced before, I play bass in the Australian heavy metal band Lord. And if you want to feel a little bit reckless, you want to try something a little bit different, you can go over to lord.net.au. You can go and have a little bit of a sticky beak, see what our music is all about. We've got Spotify playlists, we've got streaming music, which is the same thing, but you know what I mean. But there's video clips, there's the whole back catalogue, there's all the historical information about the band. It gives you a really good taste of what we're all about. There's video clips and all that sort of stuff over there at lord.net.au. If you love a bit of melodic singing, big choruses, cheesy guitar solos, and all sorts of really cool fun stuff, go and give that a whirl over at lord.net.au. In addition to playing in a heavy metal band, I also host the Self-Starter podcast, which is all about small business, self-employment, and freelancing. If that floats your boat, you can go over to selfstarter.com.au. There's a blog over there. There's also the podcast itself that comes out fortnightly. You can search for the Self-Starter podcast in the podcast player you're listening to right now. But, whether you're in a job that you hate and you want to get out of it, or you want to earn a little bit of extra pocket money on the side, or you're about to start your own business, or you know somebody that ticks any of those boxes, maybe Self-Starter is the podcast for you or for them. Go and check it out, selfstarter.com.au. Now, if you are new to the podcast, each and every week I do a shout out. I thank somebody that supports me and the podcast, and it can be a range of different ways. It could be a message of encouragement, a little bit of positivity. It could be a review somewhere on the internet. It could be a bit of social media love. It could be buying some merchandise from the online store. It could be shouting me a beer via the PayPal button over at andysocial.net. Whatever it is, big or small, it goes a long way. It keeps me fueled, it keeps me inspired, motivated, it keeps this podcaster rolling. So it just means a hell of a lot to me. So thank you as always. I can never thank people enough. This is one of my 2018 goals for the podcast, to do this weekly shout out, and I am just going to keep doing it indefinitely now because I get so much out of it. I really love to say thank you. It sounds weird, but it's true. And it's the least I can do for what you guys do. Just tuning in each and every week, it means a hell of a lot to me. And those little 1% extras go a long way. So this is what I do. Each and every week I pick somebody and say thank you. So this week's shout out is for Stu Tyrell. Now, Stu shared one of my previous episodes of the Andy Social podcast on Facebook and included this message. And I'm going to read it out. It's a little bit lengthy, but it's really, really cool and some really nice words. And I think it's worth sharing with you all. And he shared episode 142, which was with Shivani Gopal, who's the CEO and founder of The Remarkable Woman. I highly recommend that everybody checks out that episode, but Stu's going to convince you. So I'm going to read it out. Bear with me, and I suck at reading things out, so just take me with a grain of salt here, folks. But I'm gonna stumble through it, and I quote: "More than remarkable, this episode is excellent. Spoiler alert: they get to equity in the end." Oh God, sorry guys. Our society's embedded gender disparity smacked me in the face walking into Babies R Us when my ex was 6 months pregnant and seeing two separate aisles, one pink, one blue. I work in two male-dominated industries, construction and music, and as an individual contractor and non-drinker, I'm less exposed to Barry's social situations now when I was an employee. But I've been him, and I'm not proud of it. Most of the music festivals I apply for are sausage fests that could be addressed with equity quotas. But blokes, you don't need to father a daughter and have an aha moment in a defunct department store to make a change. This podcast is our equity, our fence crate, because we fall short. Listen and share. So if you want to know more about what that is all about, go and check out episode 142 of the podcast. And I must say, my apologies, Stu, I read that out absolutely shockingly bad, but you guys get the drift. So really, really cool. I appreciate the comments, and I appreciate you sharing this podcast around, this particular message around to your circles. This is what helps build this podcast and make it bigger and better each time. So Stu, please send me a message when you hear this, and I'm going to send you out some stuff in the post. We all like getting something in the post. It's my little way of saying thank you. If you want to learn a little bit more about Stu is a singer and songwriter, and if you go to stutyrell.com, which is stutyrell.com, he has got a bunch of music on his website. He put out an EP last year called Celtic Roots, and for you metal fans, it also includes an acoustic version of Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast, which is really cool, so you can go and check that out over at stutyrell.com. But massive thanks once again, Stu, for your support and getting word out there with one of these episodes that obviously means a lot to you and a lot to many other people that tune in as well. So thank you very much. This week's episode is with Bianca Nogrady. Bianca is a freelance science journalist. She's an author. She's a broadcaster. She's a tutor. She is a jack of all trades when it comes to science. She is the ultimate science nerd. And I had an absolute ball talking to Bianca. We touched on a whole range of different subjects. And I took a particular fixation on her freelance lifestyle because, as you folks know, I have a bit of a fascination with freelancing. Go and check out my self-starter podcast, for example. But we also touched on two of Bianca's books that she released a few years ago. One called The End, The Human Experience of Death. And you folks will also know that I've got a particular fixation on death as well. I've covered it on a few episodes previous on the Antisocial podcast. You can go and check out Emma Jane Holmes and Dr. Philip Nitschke as well. We also touch on the other book that Bianca's released called The Sixth Wave, How to Succeed in a Resource-Limited World. And that's a really interesting book as well. Both books I highly recommend. I'm going to put in the show notes over at antisocial.net. You should be able to access these show notes through your podcast player as well. So there should be clickable links there. So easy access to support Bianca and any of the guests that have been on the Antisocial podcast to date as well. Really, really fun chat. I really want to catch up with Bianca again because as a journalist working in the broad field of science, Bianca is continuously talking about a whole range of different and exciting subjects. And I don't think there's ever a shortage of things to talk about. So I found myself having to wrap this episode up really quickly towards the end because I'm like, I could keep talking for ages, but obviously got to keep an eye on the time as well. So I definitely want to catch up with Bianca sometime in the new year as well because there's always things to talk about. But enough of me. Please enjoy this really, really fun episode with Bianca Nogrady. You are a freelance science journalist and also an author.
Yes, I am. Yep.
I know you've been doing it for quite some time, but I'm really fascinated, and I've been fascinated for quite some time with just freelancing in general. And has that been something in the past or even now that it's still daunting at times, living that kind of lifestyle of being a freelancer?
I think the only thing that is a kind of constant source of stress as a freelancer is cash flow. So the income itself is actually really good. It's probably more than I'd be getting if I was working in-house. But you never know when you're going to get paid. And so you send out these invoices and sometimes you get paid within a week and sometimes it takes 6 months. So the cash flow for me is probably the biggest issue. And I think, there is also that notion that if you get sick, you don't get to take a day off and still get paid, or, you can't, if you take holidays, that means you actually don't get paid for the time when you're not working. So it doesn't have, you miss out on a lot of the benefits of being a salaried employee, like sick leave and holiday leave. And look, those are actually, for me, the only two big downsides of being a freelancer. Everything else about it I love.
I think it's one of those myths that's slowly being shattered out there in the stereotypical, the traditional workforce, where a lot of people associate stability with employment and having that traditional job and thinking that, those sort of entitlements that you would get under an employer, it's not as stable as what it used to be, when I guess the industrial age kicked in and people had those traditional types of jobs. But now it's, there's the amount of restructures that organizations go through all the time. Nobody's job is ever safe. So in some ways, having the control back in the individual where they can create their own income is probably more enticing. It's probably more stable than relying on somebody else to ensure that you continuously get paid.
Absolutely. And look, I think particularly in media, 20 or 30 years ago, there were in-house jobs in media and you had that job for, well, maybe not quite for life, but it was fairly solid employment. Whereas these days, nothing is solid in the media. I mean, there's constant layoffs happening. There's barely a month that goes by without some huge numbers of newsroom layoffs at sort of the major metropolitans. Media outlets. And as a freelancer, my income comes from maybe 7, 8, 9 different places. And so if 1 or 2 or even 3 of those fall over for some reason. Maybe they change editors, and so I don't necessarily have that contact there anymore, or even the publication goes under, which does happen, or for whatever reason they stop using me as a freelancer. I have other sources that I can pick up, and then I can go, okay, well look, I'll go and find some. I'll start pitching to some new editors and find some new outlets to try and get more kind of regular work in. So you're right. I think it does offer, in some ways, it offers greater job security than I think a lot of in-house jobs do in media at the moment. But the downside is you really, you are sometimes right up against the wall in terms of the kind of the cash flow issue. And certainly getting a start as a freelancer, you really need some kind of backup, whether that be, a partner who's got a more stable job with, or you've got some kind of financial buffer zone. Like I try and always sort of say to people, if you're interested in being a freelancer, that's great, but make sure you've got, $5,000, $10,000 somewhere that is there for, it means you can still pay your rent or your mortgage or, whatever it is that you absolutely have to pay. You can still do that while you're waiting for those invoices to come in, because sometimes they don't come in and they don't come in for months, and you really need to have that security. So it is, there is a certain level of privilege to be able to be a freelancer in terms of my own circumstances, and it's at least starting out anyway.
And I think it's that planning in advance before you make that decision, which is the critical sort of point of difference as to whether somebody's going to succeed or not. Because I think a lot of people get really swept up in that intoxicating excitement of quitting your job and telling your boss or your employer where to shove it, and walking out the door and all high and mighty with grand plans to do your own thing. But
stick it to the man.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've certainly had these moments, and you're right. And I think a lot of people don't really sort of plan ahead and go, this is going to be a 6-month or a 12-month or a 18-month transition where I need to really sort of put the groundwork in first, build that buffer zone, and even just working out what my life's going to look like when I eventually walk out the door. I mean, what sort of contacts do I have? What's my network? What am I actually going to do? I mean, there's a lot of ideas that people have, but they don't actually think about what that day-to-day is going to be, because the day-to-day can be quite grueling and probably, I always say it's character building, because you're really sort of reliant on yourself, and you start to see your own limitations and your weaknesses. So it's something that can be quite daunting for people.
It is. And I think, Sex and the City really didn't do the notion of freelancing any favours, because it gave you the impression that you could write one article for Vogue a month and be able to, be neck deep in Manolo Blahniks, which is not true. I don't know any writer anywhere, no matter how famous, that would be able to actually pull that off. So, it's particularly from the perspective of a freelance writer or journalist, you are not just a journalist, you are also a small business owner. Yep. And so a lot of freelancing is hustling. Whether that be hustling new work or even hustling payment. But also, you have to manage tax and superannuation and accounting, and you have to be on top of this as a business owner. And I think there's a very romantic notion around freelancing that it is this, there is a romance to it, or certainly freelance journalism, there's a romance to it. But it is, you have to work damn hard, because if you don't, the money doesn't come in. And that, I think some people, that is energizing. I certainly find it really energizing. It's nice to have a little edge of panic on things. But for other people, I think they don't necessarily make that connection between the fact that, you can't just sort of write the articles that you've always dreamed of writing and expect that you can run a whole business on that. You're going to have to do a lot of work that you don't like, but because it pays the bills. So there is always going to be a mix of doing stuff that you love. Sorry about the pinging in the background. Oh, that's okay. Doing stuff that you love that maybe you do get paid well for, which is great, but most often that stuff that you love is not always the stuff that pays as well. You've always got to have a mix of that, and then the stuff that comes in regularly, pays the bills. It's not necessarily going to float your boat intellectually or as a writer, but you need that to survive as a business.
And you mentioned before, your streams of income are going to come from several different places, 8 up to 9 different places, just, as a general number. Did you find that over time, as you sort of become more, I guess, I'm trying to think of the right word, but I'll just keep it simple, used to the freelance lifestyle, that you've found yourself having to acquire new skills or having to get out of your comfort zone to put yourself into positions where there's different types of opportunities made available for you. So yes, writing is your big strength and something that you've made a living from and you've had success with it, but doing other types of things, because I noticed that you've done some radio work, you've done public speaking, you've done some teaching, like tutoring as well. So is there a number of different things that you sort of over time you've gone, this is something that I need to upskill myself and learn in order to ensure that my value's there in a multitude of different ways?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, diversity, I think, is part of the key to success, because it creates a more resilient business. If you do have a range of skills, you're not entirely dependent on just one skill. You are adaptable. You can work, if an opportunity comes up that requires you to have a particular skill set, like doing podcasting, for example, or doing, including some audio-visual content in something that you provide, then it's good to have access to as many skills as you can, which is not to say everybody has to be an expert in everything. I mean, my husband's always sort of trying to get me to do podcasting, and because I know that I should, and at some point I will, but because that hasn't necessarily come up as something that I've needed to do for my work, there's less pressure for me to kind of get on top of that. I guess I'm thinking about other areas like radio. I guess I've sort of done radio on and off for nearly 20 years. And that's something that I love. And I have also found that it's very useful in terms of a kind of an added element to the work that I do. Web design, setting up a basic WordPress websites, it's a fairly minor thing, but it is a really useful skill to have. So I think diversity really is important, and also being open to doing things that you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise gone out and sought as a job. But for example, like I've done a couple of situations where I've done some research for a documentary series, just like a sort of a background research. And it's not something that I would do all the time, because ultimately I love writing and I like my words to be read by people. And so this was sort of more a research job. But something comes up, it's like, yeah, I'll give that a go and see how whether it works for me. So you need to be open to new opportunities as well. But as always, make sure that you're actually interested in doing it. I think that's kind of important as well. The whole benefit of freelancing is that you do get to pick and choose the jobs that you want to do. So it's good to have that balance.
And I guess that would also help with your continued demand to be able to obtain different opportunities as well, because if you're interested in it, then your authenticity is going to come through the work that you produce, which means that it attracts people, your quality is going to get better, and obviously that value is there for the people that are going to be digesting your content.
I hope so. I mean, yeah, I love writing. I've always loved writing, and I don't think that will ever change. And I love doing radio, and that's always been the case. And I don't think that will ever change. And so, I think that's those are two areas where I think I do a reasonably good job, partly because I love it and partly just because I've been doing it for so long. And hopefully, I'm still learning. I still kind of like to think that my writing is still improving, and hopefully my radio work is still improving. But yes, we're always learning. We should always be learning and trying to be better at what we do.
Do you think that with the field of science, and that being the umbrella focus of a lot of your writing and the approaches that you've taken, that sort of, I guess that has helped you with the way that you approach your day-to-day life, as far as that experimenting, trying new things, learning, and always having, I guess, the passion to continue to learn. No doubt just being immersed in just the field of science in a general sense would probably just would get those right behaviors already, like they're already there, because I think science sort of embraces that continuous learning and that curious nature, and always understanding that it's okay to be wrong, and it's okay to fail, because that's part of the process of learning and getting to the truth.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a nerd since the year dot. I do love science. I don't know whether that's made me more curious, or I love science because I am already a very curious person. I mean, I think, that's a tricky one. I think certainly writing about science makes me more focused on looking for the evidence for things, and ensuring that what I do write is grounded in evidence, and that I can back up whatever it is that I've written or said with some kind of evidence. I mean, which I think is more important than ever these days, with all of, with accusations of fake news being slung around by everybody who doesn't like what they read in the newspaper. As a journalist, it's never been more important to be able to verify and back up whatever it is that you say. And, I'm fortunate to work for a number of publications like Nature and Undark, science magazines, whose, fact-checking is incredibly rigorous, and it gives me greater confidence as a writer, because I have confidence in what I've written and the stories that I've told, and I think that's a good practice for any journalist to do that. And I think probably most journalists do that as a matter of course, is just to make that can you actually back up what you've written? Can you point to where that evidence has come from or that statement has come from? I think that kind of certainly helps my practice as a journalist. Whether it helps my practice as a freelancer, I don't know.
I guess from getting to the truth and relying on fact, that would, I think it'd probably be the case in all fields of science, where you might have a bias that has just been ingrained in you from upbringing, environments, the people that you've associated with, the information that you've been exposed to over time. And when you're focusing on a particular topic or article, that you might have an unconscious bias sitting there. Do you find that sort of that approach that you've just explained really sort of can potentially at times uncover some of the vulnerabilities that you have as a person, and having to sort of really sort of I'm just trying to think of a good way to explain this, but sort of check yourself as you're going through this process of documenting and putting an article together?
Yeah, I think I have reached a point where I am aware of, and I think reasonably aware of my kind of personal bias. Anyway, I'm not sure what the plural is, around issues like obviously climate change, human-induced climate change, or immunisation, or I'm aware that I have fairly strongly held personal views on those things, which, for the record, obviously I am a firm believer, not that it needs me to believe in it, but I'm a firm believer that human-induced climate change is perhaps the greatest threat to ever threaten humanity, and I also firmly believe that immunisation is one of the greatest scientific and medical achievements of humanity. Absolutely. In terms of lives saved. Yeah. So I'm conscious that those are in me, and it's fairly rare these days to cover something that challenges those bias, not because I actively avoid writing about anything that would contradict my own personal views, but just because I think my views are generally supported by the evidence, and so it's pretty rare for something to come up to actually contradict those. Having said that, there has been a story where some I was asked to write about, and this was a kind of a contract science writing situation, so it wasn't a journalism piece of work. It was writing for an organisation where they said, "Oh, we've got this study that's coming out," and it was challenging vaccination. But having looked through it, it's like there was the evidence here, and I sort of fed that back and said, "This is going to open a massive can of worms unless you've got some really, really solid evidence to work with this." And I would have been uncomfortable being involved with that project because I felt that it was going to be highly problematic. The message was going to cause serious problems from a public health perspective, and I didn't think that the evidence was there to justify the claims that were, or the kind of arguments that were being made. And the whole thing kind of went away anyway, because I think for whatever reason there may have been some internal situations that changed. But I try to be open-minded. And I'm conscious that that's generally very difficult to do because I'm an opinionated person. But I think, to my mind, part of being a journalist is interrogating your own beliefs and being aware of those when you're writing and trying as best you can to not let those influence what you write. But how successful I am at doing that, I really don't know. And I guess this is where I kind of come back to trying to rely on the evidence. But I'm also aware that journalists, we seek the truth, but really what is the truth? It is still a subjective thing. I don't believe it's possible for anyone to be truly objective. Everything that we view, the selection of whoever we choose to interview, the selection of quotes that we use, all of that is influenced by our own subconscious bias. So we can strive for objectivity, and I think that's about as good as we can do, is to be aware of bias, strive for objectivity as best we can, recognising that we are very subjective and fallible creatures.
Well, it's one of the fantastic things, but also one of the worst things about the internet is that you can search for information. You've got access to information. People have the opportunity to be more knowledgeable than ever before. But if you have a slightly skewed view on a particular topic, and there might be a bit of bias there, that you can find a community of people or information on there that's going to feed that particular bias that you do have. So as you said, like there's always different layers of truth, and it can be subjective. And I think the people that are probably the most authentic are going to always aim for an objective approach with the work that they produce. But there's just so much noise out there that it's really difficult as people get that thirst for learning and want to learn more and want to understand more about the world around them and their own experiences, their own life. And as you're going through and trawling through all the noise out there on social media as one thing, but just the internet in general, you find that it can be quite confusing. So it is a lot of work for your everyday person to try and understand or get clarity on some of these really sort of debatable topics. Whereas I guess someone that's a journalist, the same challenges are there, but obviously you've got an objective to get to that final outcome. So you understand what is needed to be able to get to that outcome, whereas your everyday person's really going to struggle with the amount of content and noise out there, and a lot of it's rubbish.
I think that is really the information overload is such an issue. But there is no truth. I really believe there is. Science doesn't prove anything. It merely, it just gets to the point where the weight of evidence is so overwhelming that there's very little, that's ever going to change that answer or that understanding. Having said that, sometimes something comes along and it throws a complete curveball and everything goes up in the air again. But, I think that there's also this notion of confirmation bias that we seek information to validate our own worldview, and that we viscerally experience a kind of almost a visceral rejection of anything that we come across that challenges our worldview. And there's been a lot written about this, and there's been there's a fantastic comic in the Oatmeal about confirmation bias, and there's also been some other really good writing about how we can be aware of our own reaction to reading something we disagree with, that we actually feel it almost as a kind of a physical rejection of it. And so I think part of the challenge, particularly in the world that we find ourselves in at the moment, is to try and kind of move a little bit beyond that to being able to hear what the other side, which makes it sound very combative, but I think it is kind of combative at the moment, to be open to understanding, maybe, not necessarily agreeing with them, but at least understanding why they hold those views. And I think, we kind of need to reach across the divide as much as possible. And I like to think that, journalism has a role to play in trying to kind of distill the essence of so many of the issues that we face, and to provide a kind of an evidence-based or fact-based perspective on things. But, the media is biased. I know that I am, as someone who reads The Guardian and reads ABC Online, those are my major news sources, and I know exactly that paints me very squarely as a lefty. And whereas if I was much more inclined to kind of read the Daily Telegraph and watch Fox News, that paints me into a completely different corner. So, there's no sort of objectivity in media. Everything is, we still seek out the media that confirms our view. And I think that's also been something that's changed with the media over time. It used to be that you'd open a newspaper and you'd read different perspectives. I mean, Miranda Devine used to write for Fairfax, used to write for the Sydney Morning Herald, and you would be challenged by a range of viewpoints within a single newspaper. And I think that certainly the kind of the mainstream media has become, to a large degree, much more polarised. I would argue that the ABC is not, but I also recognise that, that there generally speaking, that people who love the ABC probably fit more to the left of centre than to the right of centre. So it is a really challenging time. I think it's one of the big challenges for our time is how to depolarise ourselves politically and be open to at least hearing the viewpoints of other people without kind of having this knee-jerk rejection of everything that they say as being highly offensive. I don't know how to do that, because I have that I have that reaction every day. I kind of open the media and just go, ooh, and just completely lose my whatevers, because I see what's being said and think, how can they possibly think that? They must be absolutely ridiculously stupid. And that's not a constructive approach to take, which I recognise, but I haven't worked out how to move beyond that.
Well, at least, I mean, you've got half the battle, ticked off by actually reading and being aware and having that awareness, where I think the big challenge that we have at the moment with, I guess, probably the more everyday person out there is that because we're bombarded with so much information, a lot of us aren't actually reading things. And so we're in that era of clickbait headlines, and people, their perception of topics and the world around them is based on a one-liner, and which is setting a particular tone, and it's there purely as clickbait, because a lot of these online publications are trying to get hits and views, and so they're trying to attract people into the article to read it. And so a lot of people are not even clicking on the article, they're just sharing the headline, which is something that's quite scandalous or controversial and something that gets people talking. And that's, I mean, I think that's a good thing about podcasts, is that what I've found in my own experience of just talking to lots of different people is that it's sort of unfiltered. I mean, yes, there's bias in like the people that I choose for my podcast, and sometimes I don't realise my bias until I look back and go, well, there's a bit of a trend here. But and I always try to be very open and challenge myself along the way, but I do tend to lean in certain directions. But the good thing about, I guess, having sort of that long form conversation that's not edited for the most part, and it's unfiltered, I think it encourages people who probably don't have the time to sit down and read through content and articles, that they can listen to something that might actually spark the excitement or the need or the want to be able to seek more information and learn more. And I think we're online and flicking through news feeds and things like that, I think it does the opposite at times, where it gets too much and we don't want to invest any additional time into reading. So sometimes the podcasting and some other forms of media do help sort of nurture the curiosity that most of us should still have.
Yeah, I mean, we are time poor, and there's so much information out there. There is that kind of, how the heck am I going to get across this? And we don't have time to actually go and read the IPCC report, or let alone a kind of I guess the background to be able to understand it. And so we do rely on the media to kind of give us the distilled version, but then you're going to get very biased distilled version depending on which media you choose to get your news from. And it is a real challenge, and I think that there's such a kind of movement to kind of shut off, to actually withdraw from that and disengage from that, which part of me thinks, from a sanity's sake, is actually not a bad idea. Yeah. But then I also think we can't afford to disengage with a lot of issues like climate change. We just can't afford to. We don't have time anymore. We are out of time. And if we don't engage with it and engage with it wholeheartedly, it's going to be too late. That tipping point will be reached and it will pass. And we will be on a fairly drastic collision course with some very unpleasant consequences.
Well, and I'll take a slight tangent, but on the climate change topic, one of the books that you wrote, and it's now a few years past since it came out, was The Sixth Wave. And a lot of that talks about what the future is going to bring, and sort of being, I guess, I think one of the blurbs in there was about having a roadmap to the future and sort of looking to see how we can take advantage of the changes that are happening around us at such a fast rate, like this exponential rate of technological progress. And I guess a lot of things that people are, I think, obviously, we've got Silicon Valley and a lot of these areas that are sort of hubs for technological. Geez, I've got to spit that one out. Jeez, I need another coffee. Or maybe less coffee.
Less coffee.
Yeah, that's probably what it is. They're hubs that nurture that sort of progress. But for everybody else, I think we're slowly starting to come to the realization that there are advantages to all of these changes that are happening around us. And I think seeing the way that we've damaged the planet and damaged ourselves over years and years of different decisions that have been made by humanity, there are opportunities now to shift and, create a solution to a problem. And a lot of it is around things such as climate change. I think you spoke about waste, the source of waste being an opportunity for people as well. And I read the other day you had just put up an article that you'd published on mining sites and the rehabilitation of mining sites, which I just never even thought of. I just never even thought of that was a thing. And then I thought, of course, it's so silly. And these mining sites close down, and what do you do with it? And how do you bring them back to the state that they were in before they were ripped out of the earth? So it's definitely something that we're in an era now where people have got to make some quick decisions. But I think it's also a positive transition where people can make opportunity of a lot of the damage that's been left by us.
Yeah. And look, that was really one of the driving kind of motivators behind doing the sixth wave, which I co-authored with James Bradfield Moody. But it was that notion that this is an era of opportunity. I mean, we were arguing that this is the kind of sixth wave of innovation, the first one being the Industrial Revolution. The most recent one, the fifth wave, is the Information and Communication Technology Revolution. And, these waves are basically great periods of disruption for humanity, because you have changes not just in terms of technological advances, but for a technological advance to succeed, it actually also needs to get to markets. And so you have massive changes in markets to enable that. And then you have changes in institutions that also support that. So, for example, mobile phones would not have become the success if they, remember, we used to have to pay to receive a mobile phone call right. Or pay to receive a text. That was a kind of a real barrier to people to uptake. But also you need to, you have infrastructure like mobile phone towers and networks, and even sort of social infrastructure around mobile phone use. And so all of those things need to change, market change, technological change, and sort of infrastructure, institutional change to enable a wave to kind of really begin. And I think when we were writing the sixth wave, there really was a sense of the technology was nearly there. The markets were kind of almost championing the whole movement, but the institutions were the problem. And I think I must admit, when we wrote the sixth wave, I felt incredibly optimistic, and certainly, when it came out and then a couple of years after that, I had a really strong sense of optimism that we would actually realise the advantages and the opportunities in the situation that we find ourselves in, which is, it's the opportunities in being more efficient with resources. I've got to say I'm slightly less optimistic these days, mainly because the institutions are not coming to the party, and that dominant institution is government. The industry is so ready for this. The market is so ready for this, and we saw when we had the emissions trading scheme in Australia, it was phenomenally successful. We were one of the first countries in the world to introduce one, and for those 2 shining years, we led the world, and our carbon emissions plummeted, and the renewable energy industry was doing really, really well. I mean, we were on the right track. And then we got Abbott and it all crashed down. And now we find ourselves in a situation where we are so far behind the rest of the world. We're going to become a kind of an environmental pariah. And I think, you need the institutions to come to the party. And until they do, it's going to stymie any kind of attempts to really enact wholesale change. But it's intensely frustrating, I think, to see so much. I've been writing about hydrogen lately and the opportunities in hydrogen, and it's phenomenal. I mean, we could have a zero emissions fuel source to do long distance travel, to fuel, to replace diesel as a kind of power supply in outback towns. We could have trains running on hydrogen. There's so much opportunity, and the technology is ready. I mean, the technology, it's been coming down. Solar panels have been coming down in cost for eons. We have endless sun. I'm looking out the window now, and it's absolutely glorious outside. We have a whole coastline we could be exploiting for wave power. We have so many resources that we could be using now, and yet we're just stuck because the institutions of government, in particular at the federal level, are just not getting out of the way. They're sitting there like a big fat blockage in the pipe, stopping the markets and the technology from really being able to soar and to sing. So it's intensely frustrating because, the sixth wave was really our vision of this is how this could go. And it's so close, but also so far away, politically speaking.
I mean, the word that you said just nailed on the head, and I was going to say it myself. It is so frustrating because, we've never been more connected than we ever have before. And so with the internet and being able to see what people are doing and involved with all over the globe, and seeing other countries and their progress that they've made, and the way that they've embraced renewable energy as one particular thing, and then looking at our country, which we always, I guess the Australian culture is always holding ourselves in high regard. We're always proud to flaunt the fact that we're Australian and all these great things that we've done over the years, and we're in a position now where we're actually a bit of a joke in the way that we're not leading the way, and we are making a lot of decisions that are quite laughable in the global community. And so it's hard sitting back and looking and seeing what other parts of the world are doing to sort of embrace these change, or these opportunities, I should say. And we're sort of just sitting there, I don't know, in what we feel is the comfort zone from a government point of view, and we're going to have a lot of catching up to do, which we already do. But it's, given our country and the size of it and the amount of resources that we have access to, and this is not even fossil fuels, this is just the fact that we've got this large mass of space that can attract so much energy. There's always those talks of, getting to a point where the amount of energy that we could produce would be, it'd get to a point where people wouldn't have to actually pay for their power. It might be the other way around. We'd have a surplus, and we could actually provide it to other areas of the world as well. So it's just, it's interesting, and especially from me. I always say I know a lot about nothing, and I just, even from the little bits of pieces of information that you see online and just articles that you read, you just kind of think, whoa, where are we? Like, where's and how far off are we from catching up with other parts of the world?
I think we're one election off from catching up with other parts of the world, would be my feeling. But even then, we have there's a lot of catch up. But Australia is, from the kind of technological perspective and the scientific perspective, we are really up there with some of the best in the world around the renewable energy technologies, and we've been a world leader, like, for example, in solar photovoltaic cells. We, I think, developed the most efficient cells and broke the record for the most efficient conversion of sunlight to electricity a couple of years ago. We are at the forefront of that, but unfortunately so much of this it's just not getting off the ground commercially, or it's difficult to get off the ground commercially because the government's still so enthralled with fossil fuels. And so there is, it's so hell-bent on subsidising fossil fuels in Australia and propping up a dying industry that, whilst simultaneously defunding so many other, areas like renewable energy and cutting funding to the clean emission, clean energy fund. They're doing everything they can to hamstring our kind of opportunity to really transition to a low carbon or zero carbon economy, or decarbonize the economy. So I really don't know what's going to happen. I find it profoundly depressing at the moment.
On the other end of the spectrum, obviously that's from an overarching sort of way forward for a country or for the globe to move as far as our consumption of energy. But I guess on an individual level, I've certainly noticed, and I guess just with technology advancing at such a dramatic rate, is the way that we consume is very different to what we did decades ago. And we're in an era now where we're still trying to catch up. We're still trying to find ourselves, but we're getting to a point now where tangible items aren't as valuable as what they used to be. And we're finding that whole share economy is being more embraced. And I think we're finding that services are far more valuable than the goods themselves and the experiences that come along with it. So I think I mean, obviously we've still got massive consumption issues, and there's a lot of wastage that we all are connected to. But I tend to get the feeling that a lot more people are starting to put more value in the non-tangible than the tangible.
Yeah, I think so. I think we're still an incredibly consumerist society. And a throwaway society, a single-use society, and even just waste. Food waste alone is a massive issue in Australia. Well, it's a massive issue everywhere, but Australia, I think, we certainly have nothing to be proud of in that space. But I think business model in a lot of areas is changing from product-based to service-based. And I think something like GoGet, the car share, or there's a number of them, but GoGet was really first cab off the rank of the car sharing services. Is a great example. Why buy a car when you can, pay for the service that a car provides, which is mobility, without actually having to own the car itself? And that, particularly in Sydney, where a parking space can go for more than a house. Maybe not quite more than a house, but they're pretty expensive. Absolutely. And so it becomes a situation of why do we all need to own a car when we can car share? So yeah, that shift to service provision rather than product sales is definitely a really exciting area, and it's happening in a lot of different spaces. I guess the challenge is to make sure that there's still kind of adequate remuneration for the people who operate within that economy, because it can be tricky, and there's the potential for exploitation as well. But yeah, that hopefully will shift things. But we're such a consumerist society, and I don't know how that will change yet.
Yeah, I think obviously it's a big ship to steer, and to change people's habits, and going back to what we were speaking about before with our bias, and a lot of this stuff comes from environment and habits and who we grow up with, and the views on the world, or the views on ourselves that are ingrained as we grow up. A lot of people put a lot of importance on things that are actually not that important in the grand scheme of things, and I think sometimes with these businesses that are going through this era this new era of disruption, I think it's sort of sending messages out into the public domain that people can change the way that they think, and they can approach things from a different angle. And maybe it's just me and my own bias, and I've just been more attentive and aware of a lot of these changes. So for me, it looks like it's more visible than somebody else that doesn't care about it as much. But I see a lot of people embracing the whole minimalistic lifestyle as well, and sort of really sort of putting their money and their value in experience, rather than trying to accumulate trophies of various tangible objects to be able to distinguish themselves from other people in society. So yes, I think probably on a grand scale, I think we've still got a hell of a long way to go, but I've certainly noticed, just maybe just my own awareness, that I think a lot of people are sort of starting to look at things a bit differently, and some of these these companies that are embracing that sort of sharing model are helping to sort of send that message out there that are forcing people to think a little bit differently.
I think it's a lot happening at a community level in that space. I live in the Blue Mountains, and there's, it's like just earlier yesterday we had some leftover pallets from when we built our house a couple of years ago, and so put them on a garage sale site. It's like, does anyone want some wooden pallets for free? And someone comes and picks them up, or there's always people. There is a lot of we're rather than throwing stuff away, of being able to kind of, and this is something I guess the internet enables, is a way of actually finding a new home for things that we don't need anymore, as opposed to just throwing them out, or burning them, or just leave them in the rubbish. And so that's actually really positive, and it's a way of building a community as well, is that sort of sharing of things that might in the past have just been thrown out. So yeah, I do like that gives me kind of cause for hope for the future.
I think one of the things that I don't know whether it's going to take off, but one thing that I sort of thought that might be something tangible later on down the track is that we will kind of go back to a bit more of that bartering system in society. And I think the way that we just what you said then just sort of triggered that thought, and having sort of people understand their own items and being resourceful and, trying to save money and cut costs here and there. We're usually plagued with a whole range of different items in our homes that have not been touched for several years or maybe several decades, depending on the age of the person. And, those objects may not hold any value anymore. And so what we find is that there are other people, it's like the old saying, one man's trash is another man's treasure. And I think sort of that bartering system may be something that will take off or be brought back into society again down the track as people sort of find other ways to obtain particular items of value.
Yeah, well, I mean, even up here again, there's an online group of, I think it's called Grow, Swap or Sell, and so people, if you've got an excess of rhubarb or zucchini or whatever it is in your garden, you want to swap for some eggs, or you've got an excess of eggs, and there is actually a group for that, where it's like, hey, look, I've got 2 dozen eggs, I can't possibly eat them. Is anyone looking for potatoes or this or that or the other? And so that does happen, which is very old school. And it used to work when we lived in small communities where everybody knew everyone. That could just happen by word of mouth, whereas now we're kind of living in larger communities, but it's the internet, I guess, has become that kind of community marketplace. And that's quite fun. I do, well, not even fun. I think it's a really kind of nice way of operating when you've got an excess of something, to be able to trade it for something that you need.
And on a human level, I think it's also it's a very positive thing for individuals to have that feeling of value. They're useful in their community. They're useful to other people. They're able to provide something and be of assistance to somebody else. And I think that's something that a lot of people, maybe years gone by, have probably lost a lot of that feeling and probably just felt like they're a bit of a number in the old rat race. And I think being able to sort of provide value to other people in their community and contribute is a big thing that's probably hasn't been focused on for a while.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Speaking of, I guess I've got my bird going off in the background, so apologies if you can hear a cockatiel going crazy. It's my
very cute.
My bird Larry. We're talking a lot about sort of, I guess, change of perspective and the way that we look and on all aspects of life, and science is obviously this big thing that's enables us to question things and be curious and look at things and challenge our own bias. The other book that you wrote about death, The End.
Yes.
I'm really curious about this, and I've had a couple of people on the podcast in the past that have really sort of challenged the way that we look at death. I had Dr. Philip Nitschke, who is famously known as Dr. Death, and I've had another young lady by the name of Emma Jane Holmes that works in a funeral parlour. And she's doing her best to sort of talk about death and even the funeral industry in a different light. And she's in the progress of writing her own book. And I've found that it's an interesting topic to talk about. And when you talk about it with your friends and family, it's really clear to see how much we avoid it. How much fear is attached to it, and looking at tradition and the way that we approach these events is, I think when you get a bit of awareness, you realise like how, it's not the right word, but the word that comes to mind straight away is ridiculous, the way that we approach it, because I think you've noted that this is something we all share. Everybody's got to die at some time, and I think it's an interesting topic that doesn't get talked about enough. It's been a few years since you've written it. What sort of reaction did you get from people after the book had come out? Because no doubt it would have challenged a lot of people with their own thoughts and their own experiences, being such a potential sensitive topic for all of us.
Well, I think what I found is that the people who bought The End and read The End were people who were actively seeking answers and who wanted to understand that phenomenon, and perhaps were seeking answers to experiences that they'd had or were under facing themselves, or had a loved one who was facing. And yeah, it was. I didn't have anyone say this book is terrible, which is always gratifying. I know that it could have been better written, and I think leaving that aside, I think it. I know that for quite a few people, because I did get a lot of people contacting me saying, thank you for doing this, but more so, I think writing it gave a lot of people an outlet and someone to contact. And so I did have a large number of people contact me and just say, thanks for writing this book. And then they would tell me a story of an experience that they'd had. And I think, it's interesting. We have this perception that no one wants to talk about death. And I actually think the opposite is true. I think everybody wants to talk about death. We just don't know how. And so when someone is writing a book or they read a book or something, it's almost like it gives them a way to bring it up. Because even when I was writing the book itself, we'd be chatting to people and I'd say, oh, yeah, I'm writing a book about death. And no one ever said, why would you want to do that? But what instead I found was that people would go, do you know what happened? This happened with my mother, or, I had this experience, or everyone has a story. Everyone has a story. We've all lost someone or we've had an experience ourselves that's brought us close to that edge. And so people really want to talk. And there were people that I interviewed for the book who sort of said at the end, I've never really been able to talk to anyone about this. I've never been able to share this story because they don't know how to bring it up. And it was interesting because I've got 2 kids, and after my first child, you as a new mother, you get connected to the local mothers group, or at least that was how it worked up here. And so you get, you have a certain number of meetings where the nurses of the local health centre actually organise these mothers group get-togethers. And one of the first things that they do is they go around the circle and everyone gets the chance to tell their birth story, to tell their experience, because women, who've had kids generally love talking about it, whether it was good or bad, everyone wants to talk about it. And I feel like we should do that with death, because people do need to talk about it. We do need to share that story. I think not just for our own well-being, but as a society, I think it's actually there's a ritual in it, and there's an understanding, and there's a sharing. It is a beautiful thing to share with someone, to say, this is what happened to me, or this is my experience with my mother. And, I'd actually remember sitting around with the same mothers group, a while later in a cafe, and one of the members of the mothers who had actually nursed her own mother who died of cancer. And I don't remember how it came up, but she started just telling the story of her mother's kind of final days and hours. And we all sort of sat there and she shared this story. And it was, it was really intense and emotional, but at the end of it, I was really struck by the fact that everyone kind of, we all sort of individually said, oh, look, thank you so much for sharing that. And it was a gift. It was a sharing of this intensely personal experience that was, obviously very traumatic, but it was also very beautiful, very emotional. And there was just something simple and good about that sharing of that story. And I don't think we do that enough with death, because we need to. It's a way of demystifying it. It's a way of exploring our own feelings and emotions around it. And I also think it's a way of honouring the person who's died. It is actually, is telling their story. And those were very strong motivations for writing this book. Was also just, we do need to talk about this, not just because we need to make it better or fix it, but it is, I think it's a fundamental part of being human, is the sharing of stories. And this is one of the great stories of our life, whether it's our own death or somebody else's death. This is the bookend of our life. It's as important as our birth. So we need to celebrate it in some ways.
When I look at death, and I think when I really spend some time to get some clarity around it and really sort of let the reality of it all sort of like absorb it all, the pressure tends to relieve a little bit. I don't worry as much, because I think when you realize that it's going to happen no matter what, and I think then you start to look around you and you appreciate what you do have while you've got it. And when you do see those examples of people that leave too early, something tragic happens, and there's all the cliches out there, live every day like it's your last, and all these types of things. But we know all the cliches, but we don't actually understand them, or we don't think about them enough. And I think a lot of our day-to-day habits and our actions and the way that we converse with people is based on the lack of awareness of the end, death, and really truly appreciating what we do have. And so no doubt the more that death is spoken about and people have the opportunity to really think about it, I think people would be well, you would hope they would function a little bit better while they're here, because their decisions and their actions that they're making would be different with that knowledge, and it wouldn't be an avoidance of the subject. It wouldn't be something that you would just push off to the side, or it would just only be talked about in those horrible moments of intense emotional, intensely emotional setting. And I just think, and I just look at the people that my friends and my family and people that, I spend time with, and I just look at the way that we approach certain situations. And I just think maybe this is one of those things that can help people function better.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to think about your own mortality, or even think about the mortality of the ones that you love. I mean, your brain kind of skitters away from it. It's not a comfortable thing to think about. And I think, there's sort of, I think like Buddhist meditation practices around actually picturing you holding your loved one's dead body. And the idea is not to traumatize you, but to try and actually help you to process that feeling, and to actually explore that feeling, and maybe become a little bit less terrified of it. I mean, it's a pretty intense thing. It's not something I've done, and I've heard it from other sort of practitioners who work with the dying, that's that can be a really important part of sort of daily practice, is to actually kind of explore your own mortality and the mortality of the ones that you love. And I mean, that takes a lot. It takes a lot to do that, and I think it takes an extraordinary person to be able to do that on a regular basis. But I mean, I think so much of it is really just about the conversation, and about accepting that this is part of life. And sometimes you're right; it happens in an awful way. It's a young life, or a life lost tragically, and that can be very, very hard. Not speaking from personal experience, but I imagine that would just be the worst thing to try and process. But death comes for us all, and we can't hide from it. We can't run away from it. So perhaps we can at least try and share our feelings about it a little bit more, and kind of seek comfort in each other, and in sharing each other's stories, so that maybe we're a little bit less afraid of it. But that's a very idealistic view.
Oh, of course, and I think everything's easier said than done. But I think when it's at least discussed, there's a hope that at least part of that information is going to sit and retain with people when these events or these reminders pop up in day-to-day life, that we can approach it slightly differently. I think it might be sort of the origin behind the book, but I think one of the things that you did highlight was your own experience with your grandmother, and sort of going through those final moments with your family, and really sort of embracing those final moments in a positive way in such a sad set of circumstances. And I think you also sort of questioned, is this right? And what does your grandmother, is your grandmother aware of what's going on? And so that sort of challenges the way that I assume that you sort of view death, and that's probably where a lot of that book's come from, is your own experiences as well.
Yeah, well, it was first and foremost, it was the reason for writing. It was, I had questions. I had the same questions that I think a lot of people have who have, ever been at the bedside of someone who's dying, or are they in pain? What are they going through? Do they know that I'm here? Can they hear me? I just had questions, and I'm a very curious person, and my natural instinct is to try and find answers for those questions. And then next thing you know, I'd, written 78,000 words, and I had some answers, I guess, around, I did find some answers to the questions that I had. But, I think it's a natural thing to want to know, and I mean, it is one of those things, unfortunately, for the most part, we will never know until we go through it ourselves. And then, maybe we still won't know, because it'll just happen and then we'll be gone. So it is the great mystery, and humans don't like mysteries. We like to know the answers. We like to get to the end of the book and have, worked out who the villain is, and have everything kind of neatly wrapped up with a bow. And death's not like that. But at least by asking the questions and by talking to each other and sharing our stories, I think it gets us a little closer to an understanding, and a closer to maybe not familiarity, but comfort, perhaps, with the notion.
Well, I know quite a few people that listen to this podcast have gone through a lot of tragedy with loved ones moving on, and some of these types of conversations have helped just look at these situations from a slightly different perspective, and it is hard because everybody's set of circumstances are different, and the story and the context and everything leading up to the event itself really determines how people process and manage it. But what you've written, and in addition to everything else, I think it does help people just I think, as you said, just be a little bit more familiar with it, and have a level of comfort that they can manage these situations a little bit more, and not, I think for a lot of people, there's a lot of guilt that people take on as well as fear. And
huge amount of guilt.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think just from what you've written about, I think that would no doubt help a lot of people sort of work through these situations, which unfortunately yes, individually we all eventually go through it ourselves, but we are continuously experiencing people around us having their own experiences and people moving on. And so it's going to be a continuous thing moving until the day that we move on ourselves.
And I think, that there is trauma of a death that has not been ideal is passed down, that someone whose mother or father or grandmother or relative dies in awful circumstances, or in situations where they felt they had no control, and this sort of standard, yes, they were in intensive care and we couldn't do anything, and they were full of tubes and it was horrible, and beeping machines, the trauma of that passes from generation to generation. It really has a very lasting impact on people's lives. And so I think, the more we talk about death, and the more we at least are open about our fears and our desires around our own passing and and passing of others, I think we have an opportunity to try and get things a bit closer to, to get them less wrong. I mean, you can never control death. It's just like you can never control birth. We're always told, when you're kind of pregnant, it's like, oh, make a birth plan. It's like, it's laughable. There's no such thing as a birth plan. You've got birth wishes, and you can certainly, you can sort of say, well, ideally I like this to happen. Ideally I really like that not to happen. But the best laid plans of mice and mothers will always go astray. But at least by communicating that, either whether it's the person themselves who's has a terminal illness, or who is just even elderly, to be able to say, look, I don't want to be resuscitated. It's that simple. I don't want to receive antibiotics. I just want to receive comfort measures only. Those conversations are profoundly important. I can't stress that enough. That was, a really, really major theme that came out of this book. Is one of the big advantages of talking about death is that it enables people to at least be aware of their loved ones' wishes, and so that you don't end up in these situations where people feel that, that like somebody ended up dying in a hospital, with tubes coming out every orifice, pummeled with resuscitation, ventilated. That's not, I don't think there's any person that would say that's a good death. And so I think by having these conversations, we can actually find out from each other, well, what is a good death to you? What does that mean? What would you like your death to be? Or how would you like your death to be? And I think that conversation can just make a world of difference to the experience, not just of the person who's dying, but of the ones who are there with them when it happens and who are witness to it. It's such an important conversation. I think particularly now, when we do have the medical facilities that can prolong life, but often at great cost in terms of quality of life, and also, just health economics. We spend more in the last, I think there's some statistic, you spend more in the last 2 weeks of life in terms of healthcare expenditure than in the whole of life, because, so many people end up in intensive care, which is pretty much, no one wants to be in intensive care and die in intensive care. So, it's such a simple matter of understanding someone's wishes and making sure that those are respected at the end.
Oh, can't agree more. I think one thing that I've plugged quite a few times, and I'll have to ask for some check from Andrew Denton, but his podcast series that he did a little while ago called Better Off Dead, and it was a series that he did, and it was on this topic, and and that was sort of inspired by his own experiences that he went through with I think it might have been a father or a grandfather, but it touches on all that, and I couldn't agree more. And it's just something that, as you said, the more that it's spoken about, then I think the more opportunity that people are able to the buzz term is die with dignity, and to be able to have a little bit more control over the way in which they wish to depart. And it is, and obviously for a number of obvious reasons, it's such a sensitive topic. But I think the more that, and just like what you've done with your book, the more that the subject is put out there into the public domain, and it's accepted that we're allowed to talk about it with a degree of comfort, will definitely help encourage people to get to a point where they're able to articulate their own opinions of what that end or those last moments look like for them. But it's a big subject, but it is fascinating. It's something that maybe it's just an unconscious thing, but I've definitely been drawn to it over the past several years, and it's a very fascinating subject.
Well, it comes for us all, so it is the universal truth that we are all born and we will all die.
That's right. I'm keeping an eye on the time, but just before I wrap it up, those two books that we spoke about, and I mean, they're two things that I guess overarching subjects that I find quite fascinating, but it has been a little bit of time since you have put out those books. Are you in the progress of working on another book at the moment? I know you've been doing a lot of writing over the past several years, but any books in the works?
Well, I'm actually writing science fiction at the moment.
Oh, right.
So I started working on a science fiction novel about 5 years ago, and I have an agent who's doing her very best to try and find a publisher for it, bless her, which is really exciting. Whether it'll actually get over the line, I don't know, because fiction is way more competitive than nonfiction. And I've also started another science fiction novel as well. I'd like to do more nonfiction. I do really enjoy it. It's kind of an extension of my day job, really, but I just don't know what to write about yet.
That's the big challenge, especially in the field of science. There's so many, and I mean, that was one of the things that I sort of looked at when I was putting together some notes before speaking with you, is that science is such a massive subject, and subject isn't even probably the right word, because science is just this overarching field with so many different things that fall underneath it. So to be a journalist in the field of science, I mean, you're never short of a topic to talk about.
No, never. There's never a dull moment. One of the many things I love about my job is that the variety is it just in the space of one day is phenomenal. I memean, I'm writing about government science budgets today, and I'm writing about hydrogen, and I'm writing about brain donation, and I'm writing I can't even remember what the other one is that I'm writing on. It's day to day the variety is extraordinary, which is, I love it because I just get to learn so much.
Never a dull moment.
No, absolutely not.
Well, Bianca, I'm going to put links to your website, to the books, to your articles, everything. And there's so much content out there. It's fantastic. But I'll put everything in the show notes for people to check out. And if any of those other book ideas, well, not ideas, but those books actually do get published, I'll love to be able to check them out and refer people to them as well. But Bianca,
that would be fantastic. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. And have a great day. Thank you. Hope you enjoyed that chat with Bianca Nogrady. If you want to check out more of Bianca's work, you can go to biancanagrady.com, or you can search for Bianca Nogrady on Twitter as well. As always, I'll have links to everything that we discussed in the show notes over at andysocial.net. You should be able to access them from your podcast player as well, so there should be little clickable links. I'll include links to her books as well, so you can pick them up. Highly recommended. Really, really interesting books, great books. So definitely check them out if you've got the opportunity as well. But a massive thank you to Bianca. Hopefully we can catch up some time again in the not so distant future as well. Now, we're getting into the tail end of 2018. We've only got a few weeks left of the year. For anybody that's been listening to the podcast for a while now will know that I took January of this year off. I will not be doing it this year. I'm going to plow all the way through into 2019, all guns a blazing, and just keep this podcast moving. So what I want to know from you guys is, who do you want to hear on this podcast? What sort of guest recommendations do you have? I have a long list. I'm continuously harassing people to be on this podcast, and a lot of people are saying yes, and that's great. And I've got a lot of future episodes to share with you guys. and a lot of people in the works to hopefully organise a time. Logistically, sometimes these things can be a little bit of a nightmare, but a lot of people in the works, a lot of exciting people. But I really want to hear from you guys and understand, who do you want to hear on here? Who do you want me to talk to? So hit me up on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. You can search for @AndyDowling. You can use the contact form over on the andysocial.net website. If you can't find me, there's something wrong with you. I'm everywhere. So I'm really easy to track down. So please, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to get your guest recommendations. There's a lot of stuff happening at the moment. New Lord album's coming out soon. At the time of me recording this outro, I don't even know if the announcement's going to be out by that stage, but let's just say it's not. Actually, let's just see how many people are listening to this outro. I'll give you the album title. How about that? No, hang on. Let me rephrase that. I'm thinking on the fly here. I will not give the album title, but I'll give you one of the words. There's 2 words. First word is fallen. How about that? I had to give something. I'm so frustrated not being able to share any information, and it probably means nothing to most people, but I am excited to be able to give one of the words is fallen. It's fallen. So, okay. Stay tuned for the second word. That'll come in due time. So anyway, folks, there's a lot of stuff happening in the Lord camp coming into 2019. It's going to be a really busy year. I think it's going to impact the podcast in a positive way. You'll probably find that there's going to be a lot of Lord themed content in the podcast. I'm going to try and get Mark and Tim on the podcast. I know a lot of people have been asking for them. I've had a bit of a strategy with Tim to put him on later on down the track in the podcast when I've really sort of got some good attention and audience, and I've built this up, which is pretty much where I'm at now. And Mark, well, I've made several attempts with Mark, and he just wants the temperature to be 100% accurate and spot on in the right set of circumstances for him to feel comfortable to be on the podcast. He's a pain in the ass. So anyway, we'll get there eventually, but hopefully I get those guys on the podcast, get to talk a lot about the album and do a lot of stuff. And especially when we hit the road and start touring, that I get a lot of really cool people in my travels as well. So a lot of stuff happening. Please keep those guest recommendations coming. Any feedback that you got, please continue to share the podcast around. A lot of that social media love goes a long way. This podcast would not be the size that it is without the sharing of you folks passing these episodes out to different people. So don't worry about people connecting with the entire podcast, but if there's a particular subject and we cover something, so this episode talking about science, or in particular subjects of death and new waves of humanity and things like that. If you know people out there that would really enjoy this particular chat, then I would highly encourage you to share this particular episode. But this podcast, I should say, would not be at the size that it is without your support and your help continuously sharing it and spreading it around. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop waffling. Until next week, folks, thank you so much for the support. Take care. Ta-ta.